Hey, Jason Grigsby. Welcome to our second episode of our brand new podcast called Forecast. Um, I'm so excited to be able to take the conversations that we're having internally and make them available to other people, because we do talk about all of these kinds of things a lot, and it's nice to have a place to be able to put them and maybe engage in conversations with other people. How are you doing today? How are you feeling?
I'm doing well. Yeah, looking forward to the chat.
Sweet. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to approach something that I think happens to a lot of people if you've been in software for a long time. Let's say you have an application that was built 10, maybe more years ago. It works well. It does all of the things you need it to do, but over time it just gets maybe slower, maybe a lot harder to update, definitely a lot harder to maintain. And then you're getting pressure from other stakeholders to do new things, cool things, maybe integrate with new technology. And sometimes it's not even possible for you to do. So you're faced with this idea that I need to update, we need to change somehow, but it seems really daunting. So I was wondering, we talk to customers about this a lot. Where do you suggest people start when they're looking at something like that?
Yeah, I think one, I mean, it is not uncommon, and the longer we're in this industry, the more common we see it, and unfortunately, I think
That's true.
we've been around a few years.
We've been in it a minute.
Yeah, no, we're still really young, just young whippersnappers.
I'm brand new.
I think I like the place where I usually like to start is to figure out what the current status is, and what the current sort of platform looks like. So at the top, I think there's kind of like this big two sort of bifurcation between two different directions the current stuff could be in. The first is, for lack of a better term, maybe like desktop only applications. So maybe it's an application that was built years ago when Windows was solely dominant and it's built in Visual Basic. Maybe it's built in C. It doesn't really matter, but it really only runs on the desktop. There isn't really a server component in it. There isn't a cloud component to it. And the second piece would be applications that have some separation, right? Some separation between something happening on a server in the cloud and something happening in a client. And that client could be something written in, Visual Basic, Java, something written it could even be a situation where you're talking about a legacy application where the presentation layer and the business logic are all intermingled, sort of like older school ASP.NET sites, older school PHP sites, where those things are all mingled together. And I think figuring out that first piece sort of answers some questions about where you want to go next, because the approach is really different whether you've already got an existing server component or whether you don't.
How so? I mean, is it just that, if you might be able to focus on the client only if you have a server and a client versus like an old desktop app that is all in one?
So let's take the desktop one first, because I think that the paths there are, well, one, I think that there are fewer. The internet's been around long enough that most applications at some point have had some server-side interactions with them, but not all. Like, there are a lot of applications where it hasn't made sense for there to be a server component. So the first piece is like simply asking, like, what features might make sense from a server perspective? What could we do with the internet and the web that we're not currently taking advantage of? Perhaps that's collaboration on whatever that sort of document or asset or whatever is being produced by that application. Maybe there's functionality that could move to a server that sort of makes sense. So now, as you're looking at modernizing it, you're actually looking at shifting how much of that work happens on the client versus moving it to the server. But if you're in a situation where it just doesn't fundamentally make sense to make that distinction, um, then the web also has answers for that. For example, Photoshop now runs on the web. And it's not that Photoshop has been rewritten in HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. It's actually using WebAssembly, which is
Hmm.
a WASM, is the way that it acronym for it, WASM. And WebAssembly allows for more complex programming languages to run inside of some sort of sandbox inside of the browser. So that's why I think that it is very different if you're going down that path. Like you've got this sort of fundamental question about um, whether the web and the features of the web provide you with some advantage that you currently aren't taking use of. In which case, you're probably looking at sort of re-architecting and separating out those things, or whether you really are looking at just sort of encapsulating your application and bringing it into the web in using WebAssembly or something of that nature. Um,
That is really interesting. I knew nothing about WebAssembly. Like I had no idea how really complex apps like Photoshop did that. So that makes sense. So it's like depending on it's also like a question of complexity, right?
yeah.
And I mean, is
Well, I
it?
think there's a little bit of complexity, right? It's a bit also of like how much you need um, sort of raw processing power, because inside the
Hmm.
browser you're competing for resources with other tabs and things of that nature. Um, I will say that I wouldn't. One thing you have to be careful of, I think, if you were to try to go this path with a desktop application and then bringing it into the browser in that way, is making sure that you're accounting for device diversity and the varying types of input. Because if you've built
Hmm.
something that was only ever designed to work, on a large screen and only designed to ever work with, like a mouse finite pointer instead of, somebody being able to use it with their fingers, um, you could move it into the web and it could still be a pretty crappy experience. And
Right.
so you've got to make sure that you're
Yeah.
accounting for that stuff. Um, but I think that problem set, like I said, I don't think is as common, but like separating out those two from like just a desktop only versus something that's got a client and a server component, I think, um,
Yeah.
makes a difference on where you go.
So on let's talk the more common thing, which
Yeah.
is that you've already got maybe some client server architecture already. How do you take it then to the next level? Like, what do you think about? Do we start looking at features and how features translate?
Again, I think like we end up with what I see a lot of is like two different versions of this. So the first version is um, you've got some sort of client like a Java application. We've worked with a lot of Java applications that are converting, or
Yep.
there's a Visual Basic application, and in that scenario, you have APIs that application is referencing,
Mm,
and so the question becomes how well do those APIs how well are they suited for moving to a more modern web? Um, and even if they're not like exactly the same, because the expectations of say a Java application from a decade and a half ago might be different than the expectations of a web application now from an API perspective, you're still going to be in pretty good shape because you've already got this expectation that there's a server responding, and so you are really looking at how do we replicate that client functionality in web technology. The other version of this is a scenario where you've kind of got these older school web applications where they've really conflated the presentation layer with the business logic.
mm,
And what you
right.
end up with is a scenario where it's really hard to update it because there's a whole bunch of assumptions. To give like a really like low level example, we've seen a few ASP.NET sites where an old school ASP way of doing things was to encapsulate the entire page in a form, and everything was form
Right.
interactions. Every interaction was forms, and so actually changing the layout of those devices or those web applications to support multiple devices becomes really hard because like the assumptions, the fundamental web assumptions are just wrong. Like the web of today is not the web of 5 years ago. Um,
Right.
so in both cases, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get some sort of separation, right? So in one case, you've already got that separation because you've got a client server paradigm in place with a Java app, responding to a server. In the other case, it becomes a question of how do we create that separation? And one way to do it would be to do something similar to what we used to do in the early days of the web, which was, we had these old mainframe computers that had no idea about the web, and we kind of shove them in a closet, and then we'd put like a Linux server in front of them and like create a connection to them. And then that Linux server would help make sure that the business logic that was on the mainframe could continue to like be useful in the new world. Well, we could do the same thing with these old applications
Hmm.
that have that sort of combination. We could essentially say, okay, this old app is going to continue to do what it needs to do on the server. We're just going to set up a new server right alongside it, and we're going to build some APIs out of that old server so that now we can create something with new architecture. And the really nice thing about
Hmm.
creating this separation is that once you have a client that's consuming APIs, you've sort of like made that layer of separation between the presentation layer and the business logic. Then you can start replacing portions of the business logic so long as they support the same APIs that the client expects. Otherwise, you're like taking on
Right.
everything all at one time, and the
Yeah.
risk is just like really huge.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you were saying that. Like if you have this almost like a middleware layer that's doing the communication, you can start building off pieces and you don't have to be like shut it all down for a year. I mean, sometimes replacing the entire thing could take even longer than that. I worked
Right.
on a site that was in classic ASP, and we were updating it to ASP.NET because it was the new thing way back when. And yeah, the idea of being like, we're going to redo the entire application on a new platform was terrifying. So we were able to take, okay, cool, this page was going to be, or this feature was going to be new, and we're going to try to seamlessly integrate it so that it's not as jarring to the user, but you will know that some of the things are new and some of the things are on deck. I hope that I left before that finished, but I assume that translation finished. It was long though. It was long, but at least you were making progress. It
Right.
wasn't quite so
Exactly.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
Are there are there as I hear you talk about sort of the really big concepts here of like how you look at it and how you approach, I still feel like it's very daunting. So one, we talk about like being able to architect it so you can break off individual features, so maybe it's a little less daunting. Are there more ways of looking at it to make it a little less scary, overwhelming, risky?
Yeah. So I think that the idea. So first, like knowing where you're going is the most important thing, right? So if you have to figure out, okay, where do we want to get at the end of this road? Okay, we want to get to the
Mm-hmm.
point where we've moved this into like maybe our intermediary step is we're going to move this into the closet essentially, and we're going to have APIs that are interacting with it, and eventually we're going to replace those APIs. Um, and just in doing that, right, you've actually split like half of the work, right? Because now you're saying all we're going to do is APIs over here. We're not going to try to replace everything all at once. We're actually just going to work on the client side features. Um, and then what you can say is, okay, within that client side feature set, um, let's actually figure out where we can have the biggest impact. And this could be decided based on like, I don't know, user pain points. It could be user
Yeah.
value. It could be opportunities that you see as an organization. Like where could we actually like if we weren't doing everything in this app, but we're only doing a portion of it, where would we have the biggest impact? And then you could carve that off and actually do that and have it live alongside that old experience. Um, and in doing so, then you're actually providing some value. And it'll take longer for that first bit because you really want to make sure that you're thinking through what the foundation will be for all the other pieces that are going to come down the road. But you can do a smaller piece and set that foundation up, and then gradually, incrementally bring more features in, bring more features in. And I mean, there are trade-offs in doing that. But I mean, shipping is a feature, right? So like actually getting
Right.
pieces
Right.
out into the world has real benefit. And particularly if it allows you to, I don't know, like use, I was talking earlier about how the web is much different than it used to be. Like, um, it's entirely possible that because of the platform that you're on, that you aren't able to take advantage of full features of the web that you would be able to now if you're starting from scratch. Or maybe you've got things that you would do with AI that you can't do because like you're on this older platform. And so this gives you an opportunity to do those things, and to have that impact and sort of show to your users, hey, we actually do care about these things. We have a plan in place for how we're going to modernize this application and make it something that, something that you rely on, make it much better in the future.
Yeah, it's Tyler and I talked about this a little bit in our previous episode. It's kind of a product management roadmap, right? Like, how can I give the users like I need to do some things that are baseline because I need to modernize, but then what features are going to give the most positive impact to my users, and how can I like prioritize all of those things in the right order so that we're making the like foundational modernization but also giving the users the benefit of this new modern application, and we don't have to wait until the foundation has been all rebuilt and then start adding cool new things or things that might make their jobs easier.
Exactly.
Are there other things to consider to help make it less painful? And with Tyler, we talked a little bit about like design systems and making sure that
Yeah.
devs and designers are collaborating, and both of those things are very core to Cloud 4.
Yeah.
And so, in that theme, are there things when you're thinking about this at the very highest level that you should really consider?
Yeah. So I really want to talk about design systems in relation to legacy app modernization because I think they're critical, but I want to back
Yeah.
up for a moment and just talk about, I think a problem that I see a lot of organizations have when they go through this process. Um, and
Hmm.
that's that they don't consider the design as a portion
Hmm.
of this modernization effort. Um, so I think that there's a couple of reasons for it, right? The big pain point is that the problem is the platform. Oftentimes the problem
It's a
isn't
technical
being,
problem.
it's a technical problem. So you turn to technical people to solve this problem. And
Yeah.
oftentimes those technical people, the organizations that you might hire, they they may be incredibly astute at the technical pieces, but they're not necessarily like their design and their user experience practice isn't quite at the level that you might want. And so what'll happen is that you'll end up with just like a web version of the sort of bad user experience that you previously had. Or maybe it was an okay user experience for like the 1990s or early 2000s or whatever it is, but it's terrible now. The like one of the most extreme examples of this that I've seen recently is actually in our state, in or not our state. You're in Washington, I'm in Oregon, but in Oregon, the state spent $300 million with Deloitte to create a modernized version of the way in which people apply for Medicare, Medicaid, those types of services in the state. It was released in 2021. It looks like an application built in the 90s. It isn't responsive at all.
Hmm.
It is super confusing to use. And so I'm fairly certain that they spent a huge amount of time interfacing with all of these complex backend systems to actually make this something that citizens of the state can interact with. But the experience is terrible because they didn't have design as a piece of it. um, and
Yeah.
I think, and one of the things that I feel really lucky about is that our designers code and our developers have mostly gone to art school. And so when we approach these projects, we look at them not just simply as an opportunity to solve this like modernization and technical framework or like foundational problem. Like that is definitely part of it, but we're also looking at it as like, okay, well, what is the modern version of this application? How do we make sure that it works on whatever device somebody has, no matter where they are in the world, that it's got that sort of, it's built for the current use. It'll meet people where they are. Um, and so that's
Yeah,
the first
it's
piece.
funny
And sorry
because
for a little rant, but I mean, I do feel like
no,
that
I
is
love
missed.
it. It's huge. Because you're right. Like, I mean, even in my setup here, I was talking about an application that works, right? Like, it probably works fine. It's aging, but the people who use it, it's like, yes, this is a 90s UX, but like they can get their job done. But it's a really important point that there's an opportunity to bring not just the technical stack to the present day and ready for the future, but the user interface. And you're right. I think that gets the technical. I think the technical problems we've been talking about, like they're overwhelming, they're big. So maybe that's why it gets so much attention. But really, like the opportunities for your users are in the design.
Yeah, I think that it's a piece of that the technical pieces lead it, and I think that the groups that are interested in solving the technical problems typically don't also have the same design skills on hand, and the people who are interested
Yeah.
in solving the design problems oftentimes don't have the same technical skills on hand, and we kind of lucked out in that, like our designers code and
Yeah.
our developers are, have art backgrounds, and so that puts us in a better
Yeah.
position in those, and so we see those as holistic problems. I also think so. I want to get back to your question about design systems because I think that is also a
Yeah.
piece of the puzzle here, which is that when we're looking at solving these interfaces, we will end up building design systems because those design systems contain components that encapsulate how we're solving problems, not just from a design perspective, but also from a code perspective. And those components end up having a lot of reuse, both through the duration of the work of modernizing that application, but then also for whatever comes after that, right? Like, say in a
Right.
scenario where you're carving off, maybe 25% of the application because you want to set a solid foundation and you're going to go do those pieces. You could do that 25%, but with a focus on making sure that you've got building blocks in place so that the next time somebody picks up the next 25%, they don't have to start from scratch. They've got all of these Lego pieces in that design system that they can use to build those new interfaces and build that new functionality. So I do think
Yeah.
that there's a huge benefit to design systems in applications, perhaps even more so than like general websites. Like it is part of how to make an application
Yeah.
more like a product.
Yeah. And it doesn't always have to be something that is like this 4-month phase of just building a design
Oh no,
system, right? Like as you were talking, I remember how often we, like, even for a client project, if that wasn't something that they were like, we really want, we will often make it as we go because
right,
it's that useful to us building up speed
right,
as you go.
yeah. And typically
Yeah.
when we're designing things, we're not designing from like the smallest pieces up. I mean, well, I guess it's kind of it can be a little bit. I mean, there's some foundational stuff we'll end up doing early on in terms of type and things of that nature. And we'll oftentimes start with small, like meaningful units. So maybe it's a so like on we were working with Walmart, it was what does a grocery product tile look like? Um, so but it's
Right.
not like a button, right? Like we're starting from a product tile, and then as we build out full pages, we may pull components out of those. We're like, oh, okay, this actually makes sense as a reusable component. Now that we see it in the design, we're going to pull it out and make it something that could be reused, and we're going to document how to use it. But we don't start from like, we're not like spending months trying to design, these tiny small pieces for the theoretical use case. We're doing specific designs and then pulling from those specific designs the components that could be reused in future work.
Right. I think sometimes people also get overwhelmed by the idea of a design system, and it's like I think Tyler mentioned this before too. Like it might just be a Figma file. Like in our case is usually like Storybook and has some
Yeah.
structure to it, but it doesn't have to.
I
Um
do think that there is real advantage from a product perspective in having a design system that is in code, because
Yeah,
your
100%.
developers are going to want to be. I mean, most JavaScript frameworks these days are built around the idea of components and reusable components, and so being able to have your UI expressed in components already means that the development team can move much more quickly in solving the unique
Totally.
pieces of a particular interface, as opposed to worrying about foundational pieces of the design.
It also helps bridge the dev design gap in general.
Yeah.
It gives developers tools. It explains the intent of the design in a way that maybe even a functional prototype doesn't always do. And that collaboration is always key to making sure that that important design that we've talked about actually gets expressed and executed in the code.
Right.
Um, what are there other considerations that you wanted to make sure that the people kept in mind?
Um, I think there's just like one thing that I think makes a difference, and this is, in some ways, I have a hammer and everything is a nail. I do think that looking at performance really matters,
Mm,
and
hmm.
I think when you're talking to teams, right? So it would be great if organizations all were working with us and we could solve these problems for them. But like we got some limited
Please.
capacity, right? Like we are we I mean, I'm just gonna be realistic. We're not going to get to work with everyone who has these types of problems.
Right.
Um, so I've been thinking a little bit about how do they avoid some of the problems that I've had a few instances lately where I'm talking to organizations and I realize, oh my gosh, you've gone down the wrong path. Like somebody's led you pretty astray in what um in what they've advised you to build on. And one of the things that I realized was that if organizations had a focus on performance, they'd probably be better off throughout this whole thing, because um, one, performance is actually like the biggest challenge that we see when other organizations are building stuff and they build stuff on top of frameworks that aren't as performant. If you had an emphasis and you had goals related to performance, then you wouldn't be able to select those products. Like you wouldn't get very far down a path. I'll just say, like you shouldn't use React. If an organization or a developer tries to convince you to use React in 2024, you should have a discussion about whether that is appropriate in today's day and age, because React is not as performant as it should be. Um,
I'm here for the React hot take.
yeah,
It's not
yeah,
very, I don't know that it's really a hot take, but for
yeah,
some people it is. Yeah.
yes, yeah, and the other piece of it is that like if the people that you're working with only know React, right, then they're probably going to run into problems because there are inevitably going to be portions of the application that can't be built in that framework, and that you need to go out to. They won't know what opportunities lie in the full web stack, and they won't be able to do it because they don't necessarily know how to program using vanilla
Yeah.
JavaScript. So,
Hmm.
but if you have a focus on performance, the people who are focused on performance likely aren't going to be talking about React in the first place, and they're also going to be picking. They're going to be, by necessity, probably going to be programming at a higher level. They're going to be creating quality code.
Yeah. It's
So that's the
built
first kind
in
of thing.
to, it's like built into the technical decisions from the beginning.
Yeah, and the mindset and sort of the approach of people who have an emphasis on
Hmm.
performance. Um,
Yep.
I guess the other thing that I was thinking a lot about is that as an organization is looking at this, oftentimes because it can be such a large piece, is that there's a bit of trying to make sure that you can sell it internally, that you can convince people that they should do this, and sometimes that can be forced by like Oracle changed something in Java and you can no longer do what you wanted to do, and so
Something's deprecated.
now
Yeah, you have to.
now you have to do it. But
But
sometimes
that's a
it's
terrible position to be in. I mean, that
no,
back against the wall is not a great place to
yeah,
be.
yeah. You don't want to be there, but some organizations
No,
end up in that spot.
sometimes you are. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I also think that that makes the decision about upgrading and doing, creating a modernized version of the application, like it's that decision is made for you. Other
It's
times
made it
it's
makes the argument easier.
yeah.
Yeah.
Other times you're seeing an opportunity. You're running into problems maintaining the application, but other people in your organization may not feel that pain, may not see the user's pain in using that application. In which case, I feel like there's probably a good opportunity that if you were to look at, or a good chance, I should say, that if you were to look at your application um, and think about the sorts of things that you might do on that new system, that there are going to be features that you would want to be able to do that you can't do currently. There might be, technologies you want to incorporate, whether it's, new features of the web platform, or whether it's stuff like artificial intelligence or whatever those types of things are that you can't do on the current version. And so being able to tie the modernization effort to, okay, not only where, and I think this kind of goes back a little bit to this idea of like not just like reporting that UI over to the web, and now it's on the web, but like looking at it as an opportunity to improve. This is also the same thing, right? Okay, let's just not think about what the application is as it currently stands, but like let's look at this as an opportunity to figure out what the new features are, what the new business opportunities are
What could it be?
that we could
Yeah.
address with this, and use that as a thing to get your stakeholders internally excited, get your users excited, and actually make sure that this transition happens before you're stuck, because
Yeah.
before you get forced
Be-
to do it by some
before you're back
external,
against the wall.
yeah, there's a security
Yeah.
problem or something
Right.
like that.
It reminds me of like when you have to maintain your house, right? And so like replacing a broken garage door is not very exciting. But if you have replaced your garage door and then end up painting your house a new color, like, oh, that's cool. And it's more expensive, but at least you have something exciting to show for it.
Yes,
I've had to
exactly.
replace garage doors before, and it's like, oh, cool, the same white garage door. There's my $5,000. Boo.
Right.
I mean, like having something that adds value, adds interest, makes it exciting, helps make the case for why it's not just a in place update, basically.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Gets people excited about it. I mean, I think that selling it internally is also really hard, especially if people are, okay, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It works fine.
Exactly.
But it could be so much more. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think that we're at an inflection point too, where if organizations haven't started working on this, both for, I would say, also for internal applications, right? So there's a lot of intranet applications that don't support multiple devices, are really behind the times, and people have just sort of let them languish because, like, okay, it's internal use, like it doesn't matter that much. But now we're going to be looking at those tech stacks getting deprecated because it's just been that long, and we're missing out on the ability to integrate new features and allow people to access it on their phones or whatever the case may be. And so this is a great time for this type of work, for people to be taking on these projects.
Yeah, and to be proactive, I think, rather than waiting for your back to be against the wall, because your options at that point become a little bit more limited and your timeline might be a little more crunched. Thank you. That answers a lot of my questions. Did you have anything else you wanted to make sure that we talked about?
I don't think so. I think I'm sorry. I did forget one thing, just glancing at my notes. Yeah. I think that we've touched on this a little bit, this idea that treating your application like a product is really important. And I think that is another area where I see a lot of organizations sort of go awry, where in the process of building up something, um, they end up building something fast. Maybe they outsource it, maybe they offshore that development, and they don't end up with the sorts of automated testing that you need, the sorts of documentation that you need. One of the things that we learned while we were working for Walmart and some of these larger organizations is like those foundational pieces, everything from like opinions on like everybody's going to code the same way, and it's going to be
Mhm.
documented, and we're going to have tools that lint our code to make sure that those standards are being used. And we've open sourced, like this isn't a big deal, but we open source our linting and our styles and like our opinions on why things are the way they are. Um, and we do that, and then we like work with organizations to figure out what they want their rules to be. But establishing that
Yeah.
foundation becomes really important, so that as you do this work, you have an application that isn't just useful and can be built for like the next year, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now, a developer can come onto the team, actually like get their environment up and running, make sure that they're coding the same way everybody else is coding, the documentation is really clear, the code itself has comments in it so they know what's going on, like all those details that I think a lot of the people who aren't in the code don't probably care as much about. Those are the details that actually make the difference between whether your investment will last or whether it won't. um and so that's
Right.
the other piece of
Makes it
the
more maintainable.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. When you say think of it as a product, I think what you're meaning is to approach it with some intention. So don't just immediately get into like the nuts and bolts of the feature you're trying to build, but give it some structure, give it some higher level like strategy and thinking so that it can have a longer life and it can like your team will
Yeah,
change, people can
yeah.
come
I
in
guess
and
it's a little weird to be thinking about an application as a product, because I probably these applications are products for a lot of those
some of them are.
organizations.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I really mean is the sort of like the tooling and infrastructure around um, a digital product, something built in code, where we've
Mhm.
got tools in place to do automated testing. We've got tools in place to enforce coding standards. We have tools in place to do automatic deploys. We have tools in place to and procedures and process in place for expectations around how we're going to comment and document. And um, maybe it's actually about being professional, right? I don't know what the definition is,
Right.
but
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like there are definitely a lot of websites, and sites versus apps versus products is like a weird distinction, and nobody has the same definition. um, but I definitely know that there are a lot of websites where that doesn't really matter. Like it isn't as important. You don't have as many people working on it. You don't have to worry about what somebody 5 years from now is going to need to be able to know or to do. Um, but that's not the
Right.
case for applications that are actually going to have a long life. They need that solid foundation. They need to have rules in place, structures in place, tools in place to make sure that there is that foundation going forward. And I think one of the really interesting things on a lot of our projects has been that when we're working with organizations that may have an application, or sometimes it's actually been e-commerce websites where they haven't actually had to or really thought about it that way. Like oftentimes they get to the end and they're like, actually, what we learned the most from you was actually this process, this structure. Like
Right.
in addition, yeah, we got the new website and it looks awesome and we're really happy with it. But also, like, we as a team have totally shifted the way that we work. And that I think
Yeah.
is a big piece of this puzzle. And it's really important for organizations to make sure that they're not like, I guess, like creating new technical debt because they're not like looking at
Yeah.
those
And setting your
problems.
right and setting your team up for longer term success. Like if
Right.
you're going to be undertaking this a little bit longer overhaul kind of process, that get the things in place that at the end of that, now you start moving into like more of a maintain and enhance mode, that your team is set up for success and
Exactly.
like they have everything they need to continue to be
Exactly.
energized about the thing that you're doing.
Yeah, we spend a
Very
lot of
cool.
time thinking about that. Like, how do we set people up so that, like, so that the people who are, and like oftentimes people from the client side will actually embed in our team and like work on issues with us. And like, we spend a lot of time thinking about that because it's so critical, right? We're not going to be there for the entirety of this application's lifecycle. And
Yeah.
even if an internal team were taking on the same process, right? Everything that I've said would apply even if it was an internal team. Those employees, right? They've probably going to find other work. They're going to change. Like life
Yeah.
happens, and so you've got to make sure that the application itself will live on.
Yep. I love this. Like, it ties in a lot to what I talked about with Tyler last time, like how do you set it up to have like a really nice, healthy lifespan? keep, keep, keep it healthy, give it its exercise. Cool. I think this was really great. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
for your 4 pages of notes. That was amazing. And that's a wrap.